As the Russian war against Ukraine continues and casualties mount, American policymakers are asking, what should the United States do now? That's the title of an op-ed by Klon Kitchen. He's a senior fellow for foreign and defense policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Klon, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So when trying to predict what comes next in this conflict, which is very difficult, you're looking at three variables. Let's go through each one. The first one is how Russia has chosen to fight this war. What have we learned from that so far?
Well, in the initial onslaught, we were all surprised by, frankly, their constraint. They largely targeted military targets, but in the final weeks here, we've seen them begin to expand as that initial onslaught failed. Now they're beginning to do much more non-discriminatory targeting of whole cities, thousands of citizens being displaced in each city. And they have moved on to a much more aggressive, less surgical approach.
And so what is the appropriate response then to that?
Well, so what we need to do and what we're continuing to do is to equip Ukrainians, one, to provide humanitarian corridors so that those citizens can move out of those cities, but then two, equipping the Ukrainian military and militias with the capabilities to attack effectively against Russian forces, which they are doing.
Which leads me to the second variable, which is Ukrainian lethality. And it would seem that the Ukrainian military has been killing a lot of Russian soldiers. I mean, we can't be sure, but estimates are over 6,000 Russians killed. How does that change Putin's calculus, if at all?
Well, it obviously provokes him, and I don't have any sympathy for him, but I think what it does is it causes him and his military leaders to understand that this is not going to be the easy cakewalk they anticipated. It obviously encourages Ukrainian morale and effectiveness. And as we're seeing now, we're seeing that begin to affect Russian tactics. It's causing them to do more standoff attacks. It's causing them to do, as I said, indiscriminate shelling of whole cities. They're attacking essentially anything within a certain radius instead of doing any type of surgical strike. And that, again, provokes broader Western commitment to supporting the Ukrainian defenses, right? So as Putin becomes more aggressive and more lethal and less discriminating, that causes Western supporters and the Ukrainian military to fight harder and more effectively.
The third variable you state is hostility bleed over. Have we just been lucky so far that there doesn't seem to be any bleed over into other countries?
Well, I don't know how much of it is luck. I suspect that a large portion of that is a strategic choice by Putin and Moscow. The last thing they want to do is provoke a more aggressive, more effective response from Western nations, and particularly from NATO nations. I think it's still Putin's intention to constrain this conflict to the borders of Ukraine for now, because at the point where it begins to bleed out, we now are moving into a much more dangerous, more critical phase of this conflict. So yeah, I think right now Putin's desire is to keep it within those borders. However, if he continues to suffer massive losses, if he ultimately concludes that he is not going to be able to realize his military aims in Ukraine, which is a distinct possibility now, there is a rationale where he decides to expand the conflict. I don't think that's a necessary conclusion, but it is possible.
So what military support should the U.S. provide Ukraine that it isn't already sending? And the president has just announced an additional $800 million in military support. What do you think?
Well, I think the doubling down on what we've been doing in terms of providing man-portable air defense systems like the Stinger missiles and anti-tank missiles like Javelins and the such, I think that's exactly right. We need to keep doing that. We're pouring it in. I'm glad to see the doubling down by the administration on that. In terms of anything new, honestly, the only thing we're not providing them that would seem to make sense is the military aircraft. I understand all the nuances and difficulties of getting that kind of material into country without provoking, the perception that NATO is actually actively involved in the conflict. But I think that's a manageable risk, and I think it would be hugely helpful to the Ukrainians. So I would like to see that happening soon.
You also recommend electronic warfare capabilities. Spell that out.
Well, so the critical capability that we haven't seen come online is Russia's use of non-state cyber actors. We know that they have a host of ransomware groups and hacking syndicates that operate within Russia's borders with at least the informal discretion of the Russian government. And at any point that Vladimir Putin were to choose to attack the United States or its allies using cyber means, it's almost assured that these capabilities will be brought to bear. They've already been attacking the United States over the last several years. We've seen a 300% increase in ransomware attacks, for example. And so it only makes sense for the United States to even now begin dismantling the kind of infrastructure that allows those types of cyber attacks to occur.
Where do you stand, Klon, on the no-fly zone that President Zelensky has been asking for over Ukrainian airspace?
Well, it makes obvious sense as to why Zelensky and Ukrainians would want a no-fly zone. So I don't begrudge them that request. I think it also makes sense why the United States is choosing not to do that. Number one, a no-fly zone is itself an act of war. And it's not like you just declare it and poof, you've got a no-fly zone. A no-fly zone would necessarily mean U.S. pilots shooting down Russian pilots at the moment where they violate that no-fly zone. And that now puts us in a direct shooting war between two nuclear armed states. And that, I don't think the situation has gotten to that point. I also think that by providing air defense systems like we've been talking about, like Stingers and other things, will allow Zelensky to essentially build a poor man's no-fly zone. I think that's the strategy right now, and I think that's the one that makes sense.
All right, well, we'll leave it at that and have to see what happens next. Thanks, Klon, so much for being on the program.
It's my pleasure.